Okay. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone in the audience that this evening's meeting is in person and being recorded, and that this room is equipped with microphones throughout that will pick up any talking. So please refrain from having sidebar discussions that you do not wish for the microphones to record. That being said, I'd like to call to order the study session of October 14th, 2024 at 6 p.m. We have one thing on the agenda. It is study session business 2025-2026 biennial budget property tax review. I call on City Administrator Jason Wilson and Chief Financial Officer Cassandra Raymond. Oh, and Administrative Services Director Jeff Steffens.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. We are going to continue our budget review process tonight. We're going to talk about all the miscellaneous funds that we have not covered, as well as spend the first part of the meeting discussing our 2025 property tax levy rate. Wait for the presentation to come up. Okay. Mr. Steffens, would you mind clicking on that?
Sorry.
That's okay. Maybe our clicker's broken tonight. It's gonna be a long night if that happens.
Swap it out.
We'll get it swapped out. So as a reminder, we are in the review process by council. This presentation tonight is items at the highest level. If we roll everything up into categories, it does not get into line item detail, but as always, we are happy to sit down with any of you at any time and get into that line item detail. So tonight we're going to talk about, on top of property tax, we're going to talk about our capital reserve fund, our occupancy tax, ARPA fund, debt service, LAD guarantee fund, REIT, which is real estate excise tax, as well as touch on our unemployment compensation, cemetery endowment, impact fees, and our firefighters' pension. I'll turn it over to Cassandra, and we'll start right away into our 2025 ad valorem property tax levy rate.
Is there a page number we can follow along on our packet or not?
Not for the property tax.
You're referring to the budget, correct? The biennial budget?
Yes.
Yeah. Not for that one.
So on an annual basis, City Council is tasked to set the next year's ad valorem property tax levy. This process starts off in late September when we receive our preliminary certification of assessed valuation for tax year 2025 from the Pierce County Assessor's Office. We've received that, and then I move forward with that process, beginning with the Finance Committee and then coming before Council at study session. A little information about our property taxes. It is the most stable source of revenue into our general fund. Property taxes are considered essentially 100% collectible because of the way the statute is written. Property taxes are our primary lien against properties, and so we don't have any issues with collectability. It makes up about 20% of our general fund revenues. And again, on our timeline, Finance and Personnel Committee, we actually had this presentation on October the 10th. We have a public hearing scheduled for next Monday, October the 14th. A resolution 1700 will come before council on November the 4th for action. And then by statute, we have to pass our resolution and certify our levy request to Pierce County no later than November the 30th. So I kind of start with that November 30th date and I work on backwards. Under RCW 84.55, districts or taxing districts with a population greater than 10,000 can increase its levy up to 1% from the highest lawful levy since 1985. That's a technical phrase, I say it way too often, but really for intents and purposes, it is a 1% increase over the prior year's collections. Property tax distribution is shared between a variety of taxing districts. We receive about 9% of the overall property tax assessment. About 46% of that is is assessed by the Sumner Bonnie Lake School District, about 16% by East Pierce Fire. I apologize, it's a little hard to read on the graphics, but I'm happy to provide this. I'll find this is also available on our website. But all of the items in red are those that have been voter approved. So that's everything from the Transit Authority to fire, the library district, and the school district. We start off with our preliminary certification of assessed valuations from the county. And what we're looking at is our overall assessed valuation as well as the average single-family resident assessed valuation, changing from tax year 2024 to tax year 2025. Our overall citywide assessed valuation increased about 4.4% from the prior taxing year, and the average valuation for a single-family residence actually increased a little bit higher than that at 7%.
So going back to the school district amount, is it, there's 3 different categories for that?
So there is the capital projects bond, there is another bond, there is the enrichment, and then this also includes the state portion of the property tax that is essentially delegated to the school district.
Okay, so it's not just a 46%, it's divided between all those?
It is, it's divided between several different taxing streams.
Okay, good,
Yes.
thank you.
When we break down our assessed valuation even further, this is coming from our preliminary assessed valuation for tax year 2025. So this still may be subject to some minor changes, but between our industrial and our commercial, that accounts for about 71% of our overall assessed valuation. You can see the bulk of that, 54%, is concentrated in our MIC. Commercial picks up 17%. We have about 29% of our assessed valuation is residential, with single family making up 21% of that. I like this graph. I think it shows a really good, kind of a really good spread of where our assessed valuation is and how that supports the city. And then we get into the numbers. So for tax year 2025, what I calculated and then brought for consideration at the Finance and Personnel Committee was the numbers based at a 0% increase from last year's levy and also taking the 1% increase allowable by statute. So looking at this first column, the 0.0% increase, we have our tax year 2024 levy, $4.95 million, and a 0% change over 2024. That change is exclusive of amounts that we're also able to levy as part of our property tax levy request for additional revenue from new construction and improvements. So that's construction that was not included in our prior assessed valuation that we're now having the chance to add back onto the assessed valuation rolls. Additional revenue from annexations, as well as additional revenue from administrative refunds. Administrative refunds are for when, for whatever reason, a property is taken off the tax roll. So it's either changed in classification or it's been somehow diminished, but somehow the taxing value has been taken off. And so we're given the opportunity under statute to re-levy that. So that would bring us to a total tax year 2025 levy of $4.995 million. That gives us a levy rate of just a little over 88 cents per thousand. The monthly change from 2024, again, based on the average single-family residence valuation, is $1.28. If we move forward with the 1% increase as allowable by statute, really the change here is a 1% increase of $49,567. The other numbers remain the same. That brings us to a total levy request of $5.045 million. That brings our levy rate up to 89 cents, and the monthly change from 2024 would be $1.68.
I have a question on the additional revenue from NCNI. Is that 32,000? It seems like when we look at the permit reports and all that stuff of the things that are happening, what does that number come from? Because that seems like we've done a lot more than $32,000 of improvement.
So that is the valuation that's been added on for new construction and improvement from the county assessors, which often is going to be different than what is coming in, and the valuation is on our permit report.
Definitely, excuse me, it's definitely a stark contrast, because 32,000 represents the city portion of that. So if you look at $100 million worth of new construction improvements, then there's the lesser corresponding amount that the city would get of that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then how these levy numbers fit into our budget request. In our general fund, we see the numbers for a 0% increase as well as the 1% increase, the change of $49,567. I've calculated these based on a council direction of continuing to levy a portion for city council strategic reserve. That is, of course, at your discretion, as well as levying the same amount that we have in prior years for street operations and capital to leverage for grant activity. So we have our increase in the general fund over 2024. At 0%, we're still increasing the general fund by $39,326. That is the sum of the additional levy from new construction and improvement, annexations, and administrative refunds. And then at the 1%, the increase to the general fund is $88,892, which is the sum of those three things plus the additional $49,000 that we gained from that 1% change. And then the overall change in the city property tax between the two is $4.79.
Go ahead, Andy.
I do have a question. I'm just curious on the street operations and capital. I believe you maybe addressed this at some point in the past, but what would it seems like the cost of repairing streets has doubled. So if we were to double or increase that number, how would that impact the budget overall?
We use that fund specifically for grant match. So really it would just be where those grant matches are coming from. So it's a grant match that has been appropriated through the property tax process, or it's a grant match that's appropriated through the general fund or the capital funds.
So we're just restricting those is it by ordinance or by something like that?
It's by resolution.
By resolution?
Yeah, so the resolution that comes before council to adopt the levy request for Pierce County has a section in it that essentially delegates a certain percentage of that, a certain portion of that towards the city council strategic reserve, and then a section that delegates a certain portion of that towards the street operations and capital.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else since we've stopped?
That was the meat of the presentation on property tax. Again, we brought this before Finance Committee on October the 10th. The committee concurred to move forward with a 1% lift over the prior year's levy. And so what I've done is I've prepared the packet information for the October 21st public hearing at that 1% level. I've also prepared that packet information so the levy does include the $350,000 for the city council strategic reserve, as well as $330,000 for the streets and capital, the street operations and capital.
Anybody have issues with that? You good? Yeah. Are you good, Andy?
I'm kind of good. I would be in favor of increasing the street operations and capital by some like a decent amount, just because the cost has gone up, and I feel like that is one of the areas that is gonna. We're looking at that project on Washington Street, and we're already using some of the funds from. Anyways, I think that to me that would be reasonable to increase that to reflect the cost increases.
I appreciate that. The place to do that is actually in the budget. We can't increase property taxes any more than the 1%.
Right. So that's why it's not. That's the budget. So that was not part of the. Thank you.
Are you good? All right.
So moving on, we get to talk about all the other little funds that we haven't already seen. There are a lot of them, but most of them are pretty straightforward, so I think we can move through them pretty quickly. Beginning with the Capital Reserves Fund. This is a new fund for 2024, so you haven't seen this before. This is our Fund 004, and this was set up to account for the proceeds from the sale of the Sumner Meadows golf course. If you are looking in your budget, this will be on page beginning on page 155. So just a little history on the proceeds from the sale of the Sumner Meadows golf course. In 2021, City Council passed 2 resolutions signaling its intent to allocate funding from those proceeds to the White River Restoration Project and to the Public Works Operations Facility. Since that time, staff has been before council on multiple occasions, kind of talking about what the status of those projects is and what the funding outlook looked like for those. The original resolutions intended to allocate $20 million to White River Restoration. We've actually been relatively successful with funding on that project with outside funding partners. The other resolution had an intent to allocate $10 million to the Public Works Operations Facility. Again, staff has been before council on multiple occasions, kind of talking about the funding outlooks for those 2 projects and how really the intent of those is likely switched, with additional financial funding support needed for the operations facility, for the governmental portion of that, whereas the utilities will support the cost that's allocated to water, sewer, and stormwater. We still have the governmental portion. And then with White River Restoration, ideally, we'll be able to use less of the proceeds as we continue to put together funding packages for that. Where this will come into play, as we go out to bid for those projects, both the operations facility, which will be bid later this year, and the White River Restoration Project, as those costs are finalized, staff will be coming before council with budget amendment requests at those times to appropriate financial support from the Capital Reserve Fund. You'll notice in your budget document, we don't have anything programmed in for expenditures in the 25-26 biennium. And really that's because those are going to be separate budget asks through the budget amendment process as we really have firmer numbers on what that support looks like.
Okay, moving on to occupancy tax. Commonly, this is referred to as LTAC, but really this is occupancy tax. It's a state shared revenue that must follow our lodging tax laws that the state has adopted. So it has to follow lodging tax rules and laws when it comes to how we allocate and spend this money, but it's actually an occupancy tax in the city of Sumner. It's used to invest in projects that generate visits and overnight stays with a focus of visitors that are coming from more than 50 miles away. The intention of this fund is to align with regional tourism plans. You may recall that the Pierce County adopted a regional tourism plan last year. We did a companion plan, a Sumner Strategic Tourism Plan that interacts and complements the countywide plan. What's unique to Sumner and the city of Kenmore and the city of DuPont and JBLM is that we do not get all of our lodging tax. So that's because prior to 1997, we did not have a hotel that was eligible to collect lodging tax. That's why we get the 2% occupancy tax. Our 5% lodging tax actually goes to Pierce County, who then allocates it out through the process. There's very few cities in the state that are like us, so we are unique in that way. What we have decided to do is really invest our 2% in asset development. The county also does a fair amount of asset development. That's how we've been able to fund things like our Heritage Park design and also our Hops Alley and phase 2 of Heritage Park construction for next year. I will say that the Tacoma Pierce County Tourism Authority is starting to see improved tourism rates throughout the county. The post-pandemic slug or whatever is kind of moving its way out. What's unique about this is a lot of these conferences book 3-4 years out. And if you think back 3-4 years ago, well, it was really difficult to book an in-person conference when a lot of things were shut down. So we're finally starting to come out of that. The convention center in Tacoma is regularly booked, and they've been seeing a lot of success in the pre-planning for events that are coming in 25 and 26. As I mentioned before, we didn't have a lodging or hotel capable of collecting lodging tax prior to 97, so we have that wonky collection method. Like I said, it has to follow the same rules, and that's why we have a lodging tax advisory committee. So you might recall that months ago, or a couple weeks ago rather, you allocated $75,000 for street trees on Main Street to replace all those. And then in the 25-26 budget, you also already authorized downtown bike racks as well as additional Heritage Park tables and umbrellas. So those will be purchased sometime next year. Any questions about occupancy tax?
Can you tell me where on the budget the funds coming in for the $75,000 on those items are?
Sure. So on page 164, if you are looking up at in the revenue section, really the revenues coming into this fund are occupancy tax revenues. So these are revenues from the hotels.
Okay, so I just see like, it looks like there's a services and charges. I see that the revenue for 23-24, so that's $75,000 higher. It's only 45,000 higher. I'm just trying to figure out, is it like a grant? How does it come through on like the income side? Is it like a grant funding? Because
This is direct from the state.
Yep.
They remit it to us.
okay,
So it's collected by hotels, Airbnbs, VRBOs, short-term rentals, and then it's remitted to the state, who then remits it to us.
Yep.
okay, I'm gonna have to ask you about that later.
Okay.
I don't quite get it. Okay, thanks.
Anybody else?
Okay, the next fund we have is ARPA fund. This is Fund 115. This was set up in the pandemic era to account for ARPA funds that were distributed to cities as part of the American Recovery Act. So I'm sorry, the American Rescue Plan Act. These are also called SLRF. You will hear that very often, especially if you hear me talking to the auditor. We're going to talk about SLRF funding. That is the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So this provided funding to meet local needs both during and post-pandemic. This has a lot of strings attached to it. Everything has to be allocated to very specific programs, and we've gone through several iterations of the SLRF rules, beginning with interim rules, about 4 different versions of interim rules, and I think we're now on a couple versions later of the final rules. These have to be allocated 100% by the end of this year, 12/31/2024, and then we have an additional 24 months to fully spend down the allocation that was provided to Sumner. These funding obligations initially were recommended by the ARPA committee. That was a subcommittee similar to all of our other committees. As those funds reached the significant completion of being allocated, that was the responsibility was transitioned over to the Finance and Personnel Committee. And then those come before City Council for consideration and approval through a budget amendment. So those are formally approved by the council as a whole during that budget amendment process. Again, these are very one-time and specific funding asks that are restricted to programs that qualify under the SLRF rules. We use them for capital facilities, some strategic tourism, including funding to Heritage Park, and then also funding restroom facilities at Rainier View and Loyalty Parks. The history of this fund, we also used funds as direct response to pandemic needs, as well as to priority pay for first responders and health needs related to the pandemic. These allocations focus on asset development or direct response. There are no ongoing costs. What we'll see in 2025 is the remaining payment. It's a 50% payment for the commissary kitchen grant. That was a $100,000 grant that was authorized by the committee and by council. The successful applicant for the commissary kitchen has been through their permitting. Things are taking a little bit longer than they had hoped. And so our most recent update was their certificate of occupancy, which is the trigger for that final 50% payment, will likely be after the first of the year. So we've programmed in that funding for after the first of the year. We will be coming back to council with a budget amendment or a change from the preliminary to final budget from what's in your current pages. And that's because as we are finalizing some projects that were previously allocated to, they may not have needed to use the full allocation. A good example is the Portland Loos that came in under what we initially estimated. We're gonna have to take those balances, throw them back into the fund balance, and have Finance and Personnel Committee really review what's left and reallocate that out.
Any questions on ARPA funds? Nope. Wow, okay, you're good to go.
Debt service. So we have two debt service funds. Fund 200 is our debt service, and then Fund 221 is an LAD guarantee fund. Really, the bulk of the interesting stuff is in Fund 200. So Fund 200 accounts for the payment of long-term governmental debt. And I specify governmental because debt associated with the utilities, so revenue-backed debt, so water, sewer, storm, is accounted for in those specific funds in 401, 402, and 408. But governmental debt, so non-utility, is accounted for here in 200. Some mandates that we have, all of our debt is going to have mandates, and it's through the debt issuer. But really, one of the big ones we have is to retain an LID guarantee fund specifically, and this is a fund usually set at a certain percentage of the outstanding principal due on an LID debt, and that's to protect the debt issuer in case of any default from the property owners. So Fund 200 provides accounting for LID number 78, that's 136th and Valentine, as well as the 2023 LTGO for the cemetery building and for the bond anticipation note for the Public Works Operations Facility. We also anticipate in late 2024 or early 25 issuing long-term debt for the Public Works Operations Facility. Issuance of that long-term debt will include paying down and paying off that bond anticipation note that was issued for the preliminary earthwork out of the operations facility site.
Any questions on that?
I think.
Okay, Barbara.
So LTGO, what is that?
My apologies, LTGO is limited tax general obligation debt. You'll see that. LID is local improvement district. We have two local improvement districts where the city issues debt and pays for a project up front. The project typically benefits a certain subset of property owners. Those property owners are then assessed, and there's an assessment imposed on each property that covers principal and interest for the debt service for that LID.
And on the LID, how many people still owe money? Because I know they were offered to pay up front, but then
They are, as part of the LID, everyone is given the opportunity to pay in full at the outset in order to avoid any interest fees. I would have to circle back with you on how many we have left. I believe LID 78 is, goes through 2029. It's not a huge amount left, really because LID 78 was very much in a non-residential district. It's right there at 136 and Valentine. And because it is a lien against the property, as properties change hands and are sold or developed, generally the parties will require that the LID be paid off in order to close it. So there in the beginning, the project worked perfectly. That the development of that road really did spur development along that whole area. So as we saw a lot of that development, we had a lot of payoffs come in.
okay, well, that's good to hear. Thank you.
Anybody else? Sandy, go ahead.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the adopted debt service for the Public Works Operations Facility in 2026 on the budget? So about 4.3 million. It's LTGO. Is that just a proposed amount? Or can you
Yes.
explain what that number is?
Where are you looking? On what page?
2026 adopted, page 168.
Oh, I see. That 4.334 million, that's the bond anticipation note that was issued for the initial earthwork out of the operations facility site. So that is technically due. It matures in 2026, which is why it's in that column. And again, but that's due to be paid as part of the issuance of the takeout financing for that project. So it was interim financing.
It is, okay. And
Yeah.
so it's due to be paid off in that year.
Yes, as part of the takeout financing for the overall project. We'll roll that payoff into the financing.
Anybody else? Thank you, Cassandra.
I would encourage everyone, there's a good section of debt in our budget book that even though Fund 200 deals primarily with governmental debt, that debt section includes a description of all of the city's debt, both LID, general obligation, as well as revenue-backed debt and the things that we have in our utilities. So it's fun information. I like it.
It's only fun for you.
And we can see in the program overview, ongoing, we have our LTGO 2023, that was for our cemetery building. Over the biennium, that'll be about $730,000. LID number 78 over the biennium is about $466,000. That will be covered by assessments to the property owners. And then we have one time, the 2023 bond, this 416, this is interest costs. So the principal of 4.334 will be paid as part of the takeout financing, but we're still paying interest until such time as it's fully paid.
Any questions?
Fund 305 is next. This is in our 300 series of funds. So this is, for those of you keeping track, we're now moving into the capital funds. Real estate excise tax. This is a tax that is imposed by statute on any real estate transaction activity. This is collected by Pierce County and is remitted back to us as part of our monthly property tax remittance. So these are typically paid by the seller. It used to be a flat rate, but now it's tiered based on the value of the transaction. This fund supports eligible projects through programmed transfers. There's two revenues. There's the first quarter percent and the second quarter percent. We call them REIT 1 and REIT 2. They are both restricted in use, and they're restricted by statute to certain capital uses in certain, in some very limited case, a small amount is allowable for operations. So uses are restricted by RCW. REIT revenues are difficult to forecast. They're completely dependent on real estate activity. We've seen a big impact in REIT lately just because of the interest rates stalling out real estate activity. So we're hoping to see that begin to bounce back. This supports through transfers our capital facilities as well as transportation, parks, trails, and open space. And then ongoing, we don't have anything programmed in for expenditures. Those would come on a as needed basis, again, to support very specific projects that are eligible under the RCW, and they would come to you in the form of a budget amendment request. We're anticipating $800,000 over the biennium in each of REIT 1 and REIT 2.
Any questions? No? All right.
Unemployment insurance fund, we're going to skip over all the 400s because we've already talked about all those. So we're going to move into our internal service funds, which is the 500 series. We are self-insured for unemployment claims. Claims for unemployment are handled by Washington State Employment Security Department. So if we have a separated employee, they want to apply for unemployment, they go through the state, and then we get a bill from the state. It reduces our risk by keeping the claims really minimal that we are having our hands on. We just let all of the paperwork go through the state, and then, as I said, we get a bill for it later on. We don't program in cost for these as an internal service fund. What we do is we will support these with transfers in from the separated employees' original labor distribution as they occur. Mandates, Employment Security Department regulations. You know, follow all of the statutory regulations for unemployment insurance. And again, they're paid through Fund 501 and assessed back to the separated employees' original department or fund. No expenditures are programmed. We handle those on a case-by-case basis. I usually look at that quarterly. That's the same frequency that we get bills from ESD. Any questions on unemployment?
Any questions, guys?
Cemetery endowment care, we are into our 600 series funds. These are our fiduciary funds. Cemetery endowment care is our long-term care and upkeep of the Sumner Cemetery. Under RCW for private cemeteries, RCW requires that 10% of the sales price for lots, crypts, and niches be dedicated to that kind of endowment care. Although that pertains specifically to private cemeteries, we've implemented that as a best practice to ensure just a fiduciary responsibility to the cemetery on a long-term basis. So our Sumner Municipal Code mirrors this and requires that 10% of all of our lot sales are dedicated to Fund 601 for endowment care. Under statute, the principle of endowment care cannot be touched for operations. So the only thing that can be transferred out is any interest earnings. We've elected to keep any interest earnings within that fund just for fiduciary stability of the cemetery on a long-term basis. So it continues to grow with sales. It'll fund the long-term care of the Sumner Cemetery. And again, we generally have made a policy decision to retain the interest in the endowment care fund. Revenue only being programmed in, about $37,000. It's about 10% of our historical trend, 10% follows our historical trends.
Andy, do you have a question?
Yeah, can you tell me, what's the investment interest in 2022? Or did you guys transfer it out? I don't see, it's just a negative number, which is.
Oh, so that was a classification issue. We had years ago, there was a treasury bond that was issued, and instead of posting the accrued interest as an accrued interest liability, it was posted in as revenue. So when the bond matured, I had to pull that back out. Yeah.
Anybody else? Oh, okay, go ahead.
Our development impact fee fund, Fund 605, another fiduciary fund. So when any development occurs, the owners or developers are assessed mitigation or impact fees to offset the increased level of service that's necessary as a result of the development. So essentially growth paying for growth. Fire impact fees are assessed. Those go into our general fund 001. Those offset fire permit inspection fees or fire permit review fees. Street impact fees benefit our streets capital fund, Fund 320, and then parks and recreation mitigation fees benefit our Fund 310 Parks and Trail Capital Fund. The RCWs very much restrict these uses to capital projects that meet growth and capacity requirements. So we've got good internal controls in place whenever we're looking at tapping impact fees or development fees for use in capital projects. I work closely with the Public Works Department. We get a good idea on what capacity is being added or what growth is being addressed so that we can justify the use of those impact fee funds. Some budget impacts. In January of 25, Council approved an ordinance increasing traffic impact fees. We wanted to be sure that we gave developers nearly a year's notice of that change. So we have a good amount of developers that applied for permits in 2024 to grandfather under existing rates. So we may see less applications in 2025 until that kind of evens itself out.
So wouldn't that be in January 2024?
Yes.
Anybody else?
Do you have a question?
Okay.
Are these funds eligible for like interfund loans or anything like that?
No.
Does they sit with a big balance or not?
So revenue and impact fees, it's dependent on development activity. It's not guaranteed with within any particular biennium. We typically don't forecast very closely on these because it is so highly variable. And then any projects And you can see here what we have requested funding for in the 25-26 biennium and really what fund that benefits. So in Parks Capital, funding shade structures and picnic tables at both Siebenthaler and Rainier View, and then funding and supporting the relocation of the gazebo to Loyalty Park. And then in Street Capital, providing some funding for the Tacoma Avenue overlay, as well as Stewart Road Bridge and the 166th 410 improvement. And again, these numbers are really calculated with an eye towards what might be needed for grant match, because we want to maximize partner funding as much as we can, but also ensuring that anything that we are programming and supporting out of Fund 605 is supported by growth and capacity.
I still have a couple more questions.
Go ahead.
Okay, so traffic impact fees, I'm looking at the budget here, it says 4.5 million is the total amount, it looks like, in the balance right now. So on some kind of a road thing that breaks down, like the one in Washington Street, for example, why would that not be eligible for using those traffic impact fees?
I don't believe so.
No, impact fees need to be used for capacity adding, and when you're just replacing a road like for like, there is no additional capacity. When you're looking at a roadway like that, if you're adding multimodal, there might be a small percentage that could be attributed to traffic impact fees, but typically like Washington or Hunt, there's no way to use it.
Okay, like if you're adding bike lanes, potentially you could add something.
Potentially just the bike
But
lane.
just
Just for Councilmember Potato, you could add a bike lane. So yeah,
Get my bike.
okay. Okay, and then I'm just curious, with the large fund balance, I don't see any revenue listed for interest. So what happens to that money if it's not generating interest?
we don't program in, we will calculate interest as it goes.
Okay.
And generally what we do is we're very restricted in the things that we can invest in. Some of those things are the local government investment pool, but we also try and look at cash flow needs. And if we've got adequate cash flow, looking out and investing in a more longer term treasury. We haven't been doing that really kind of through the pandemic, because in order to even beat the pool, I would have to go out and tie money up into a treasury for several years. And just with knowing what projects we have on our horizon, I didn't want to tie up the liquidity to do that.
Anybody else?
Last, but certainly not least, our firefighters pension fund. This is Fund 611. So our pre-LEF firefighters, so these are firefighters hired prior to March 1st of 1970, get part of their retirement compensation from the city of Sumner. We currently have 2 retired employees and or spouses of our former fire department still receive a portion of the retirement benefits from the city. Additionally, police and fire retirees under LEF 1 receive medical cost reimbursement for any costs that aren't covered by Medicare. And I believe there are,
It's about a dozen.
yeah, I think it's 11. So this fund will eventually retire when there are no more participants, but right now this is an active fund. It follows all pension and retirement statutes by the state, and that includes the state auditor. We have very specific disclosure requirements for pension. One of the things that is a budget impact that we are keeping on our radar at all times is potentially long-term medical costs are unbudgeted and could have a significant impact if they are needed and if they are claimed. So that is something that, again, we don't budget because those are very difficult to forecast, not only for the dollar amount, but the timing of those as well. But it is something that could very easily overrun this fund and would have to be subsidized by general fund dollars.
Questions? Barbara?
Do you know what the age of most of the people are that are eligible? Are they 75?
Probably in that range. There's definitely there's a spread of yeah, one just turned 100, so there's a spread.
I will say there is a little bit of cost control on this. You know, if somebody ends up in a long-term medical care situation, there's a maximum amount per month that we contribute towards that. And that dollar amount is set by the Pierce County LEF board. When these boards were created, we weren't large enough to have our own. If it happened today, we'd be required to have our own. So we just follow all the Pierce County rules. And I wouldn't say it's 100%. I think the last time I heard it was in the $5,000 to $6,000 range per month for long-term medical care that is authorized, but they adjust those on a regular basis too. So
This fund is funded primarily by there's two revenue sources. We get a state shared revenue for fire insurance premiums, and then the rest is supplemented by a transfer in from the general fund.
Andy, did you have a question?
No, she answered.
Yeah, there you go.
I do have
Great.
one, when you say it retires when they're all gone, where does that go? Just back in the general fund then? Or does it
So
kick back in the budget somewhere?
no, at the point where we would have there would no longer be any retirees that were eligible for benefits. The fire insurance premium tax would end. We would no longer get that state shared revenue through the state. Our portion that we get would be redistributed out to other entities. And then the subsidy from the general fund would just remain in the general fund.
It is.
So we have programmed in currently medical expenditures right around $10,000. We don't have a large amount of those right now. Again, that could change. And then over the biennium, $170,000 for retiree pensions. That is it. We've now gone through all the funds. I know that was a lot of numbers over the past several months. Please let me know if there's any questions. I'm happy to sit down and go over any line item detail that you'd like. What we have coming up next week, October 21st, at our regular meeting, we'll have a public hearing for our tax year 2025 property tax ad valorem levy, as well as an ordinance for the 2025 compensation schedule that was also reviewed by Finance and Personnel Committee last week. And then at our study session, we'll be reviewing the utility rates that were developed as part of the rate model last year, as well as bringing some information back to council on a project that we've been working on, looking at our utility billing structure. You know, we've billed for the same way for a very, very long time, and we wanted to take a step back and see, is that still the most equitable? Is there a best practice that we could be changing? So we'll be coming back to council with that discussion. October 30th, we have a special study session beginning at 3 p.m. This is when we will be coming back to you for a budget review of any unfunded or underfunded items, along with items that City Council has brought up during these budget reviews that you wanted us to take another look at. We'll have those as well. Looking at our financial forecast, and then a general fund revenue discussion, really where our revenues are currently sitting, as well as what revenue tools are still in the toolbox. After that, we'll begin to wrap things up. November 4th, we'll have our tax year 2025 property tax levy adoption. That's a resolution. November 18th, we have scheduled to do a budget wrap up if it's needed, as well as the first public hearing on our 2025-2026 biennial budget. December 2nd, we'll come back for a second public hearing on the budget, and then we'll be before you on December 9th to adopt this thing. With that, I am happy to answer any questions.
Any last questions? None there? Anybody down here?
Great.
Wow, I think you're good to go.
Thank you very much.
City Administrator report.
thank you, Mayor. A few things. Reminder, this Friday is the homecoming parade. If you'd like to ride the fire truck, please be at the staging area at 4 o'clock. Kincaid and Cherry, look for the Kenworth there.
It's the 25th. Next Friday, not this Friday.
Thank you, Amanda.
Sorry. Sorry.
Yes, it's next Friday. Got a busy 2 weeks here, so
We
the
have
25th, right in front of me. Coming up this Wednesday, we do have a special study session at 2 p.m. to start the comprehensive plan amendment review. We also, just a reminder, next week on Tuesday the 22nd, we have our open house from 5 to 7 here, as well as council interviews next Wednesday at 6 p.m. As a reminder, the applications are available on our website. I sent you a link directly to your email as well. Happy to answer any questions.
any questions on any of that? None?
Is that the 23rd then, or do the actual interviews?
Yep, 23rd is a Wednesday night.
Are we going over that format before that? I mean, as far as.
Yeah, so all the applicants have been provided the questions in advance.
Yeah, I've read.
They'll be given 5 minutes to respond to those,
Mhm.
and then you'll have an opportunity to ask them follow-up questions. The order will be set by random draw that night, and we will be asking the applicants to remain outside the room while, until their interview takes place. However, they're not required to do so, so it's really up to them at that point. The only thing that'll happen that night is interviews, and if council would like, we can go into executive session to discuss the applicant qualifications that evening. And then the actual nomination process will occur at the November 4th council meeting. And then if you successfully nominate somebody that night, they'll be sworn in on November 18th.
Will we be given a packet of resumes or should we print them ourselves and then give them back to you guys after?
I can email them to you, and if you want a hard copy, let me know, and I can print it and stick it in your box too.
Yeah, I've got the email.
We've got an email.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We got it.
I guess you
We'll
want.
do it.
Okay,
That's everything.
that's it. Anything for council meeting changes or anything? Nobody? And council committee meetings? No? And no executive session tonight, Jason?
Nope.
Okay. All right.
Wow.
All that being done, I will close the meeting at 6:50.